Hi. So, in our last discussion, we looked at the evolutionary force of migration and we quickly saw the very basic things that migration can do. And as I promised, in this discussion, we are going to look at what are the ways migration interacts with other evolutionary forces, what are the major differences and what are the major points of similarities. And then we are going to look at a bunch of examples from real lives to see how migration interacts with many things to lead to some very interesting outcomes. So, before that we will quickly revise the two main observations that we made from the two-patch model during our last discussion. The first observation was that the overall allele frequency of the two populations will remain constant. And as I said, that is not very surprising, simply because all that is happening is that the alleles are getting redistributed due to migration across the populations. The much more interesting and important thing was that for non-zero migration, the equilibrium is reached when the allele frequencies become equal in both patches, which basically means that migration acts like a homogenizing force. So, if you look at the evolutionary effects of migration, so that is homogenizing force, that part is the main thing over here. It tends to equalize the allele frequencies across the populations. And secondly, as I alluded, it can introduce new alleles to a population, and in that sense it is kind of analogous to mutation with a few differences. So, we will quickly compare the effect of migration with drift, and we will also compare the effects of migration with mutation. So, if you compare between drift and migration, in terms of the genetic variability across local populations, drift tends to increase that variability. Why? Because you have a bunch of populations, in all of them drift is happening simultaneously, but it is a random thing. So, in some cases the allele frequencies are going up, in other cases it is going down. It is entirely possible that one allele gets fixed in first population, another gets fixed in the second population. So, if you look at across populations, the genetic variability is going up. On the other hand, migration being a homogenizing force actually ends up reducing the genetic variability across local populations. Now, if you look at genetic variability within a population, there things are slightly different. So, drift in general causes a decrease in the variability. This can happen either because a population due to drifting either fixes or loses an allele, or if you have bottleneck effect or founder effect, then you can end up having again loss or fixation due to the same thing. In the context of migration, it is actually a little bit more complicated. The genetic variability within a population can increase, for example, when immigration is happening, or it can even decrease. So, for example, there is an exit from a population and just so happens that all the individuals who had a certain trait, they were amongst the people who went out. So, obviously, in that case the genetic variation can even decrease in the context of a population. So, the main point that you need to remember is that in general drift and migration tend to have opposing effects. Now, if you look at the comparison between mutation and migration, things are a little bit more complex over there. So, both of them, they tend to introduce new alleles to a population, no issues over there, but the way they do it is slightly different. So, when it comes to mutation, as we have seen, mutation rates are generally low, and therefore at a given time if there is a beneficial mutation, that can arise in at max a few individuals. However, migration rates, they can be either low or high, they can be pretty much anything, and therefore the rate at which new alleles are coming up into the population can be much more diversified, can be much more varied when it comes to migration. And if you look at how many loci are getting affected in the context of a trait, in the context of mutation, since the rates are low, you do not really expect too many loci to get affected at the same time. So, that is why I have written it is typically one or at max a few. However, when migration is happening, you can have variation at multiple loci getting affected simultaneously, because it entirely depends on how many individuals are coming and what exactly they are bringing with them. Now, if you think about what mutation and migration are doing, the overall interaction or the overall way in which they interact with the other forces is also slightly different. So, I will give you a bunch of statements to make the case. So, as we discussed when we were talking about distribution of fitness effects, that many new mutations, the ones which actually have a change or lead to a change in the fitness, most of them are actually deleterious, and most of them will initially occur as a single copy. Therefore, many of these are actually lost from the population very, very rapidly, and I am talking about real populations which are undergoing some amount of drift at least. In most of the cases, they are very rapidly lost. Now, even if you have a mutation which is beneficial, it will either require to be of a very large beneficial effects, for which the probabilities, as I told you, is relatively small, or it will require quite a bit of time, substantial time, to reach a reasonably high frequency. However, if you think about migration, then the way migration introduces new variation is slightly different. Typically, the variation is coming from another population, right? And in many of the cases, the variation has been around in that population for multiple generations, and therefore, that population in some sense has adapted a bit better to that mutation, and therefore, it is entirely possible that when that variation comes over here to the focal population, then the way it gets established is much easier. Also, note the fact that migration by its very nature can introduce multiple copies of the new variant. So, the problem of drift at low frequency that we are talking about, that is much less over here, and therefore, there is a possibility that you can have a much larger influx of new genetic variability, which, because it has undergone selection etc. in the previous population, which is more likely to be beneficial. Therefore, the ability of migration to drastically alter a gene pool even in a short span of time is much greater than mutation. Now, note over here that till this point, whenever we have studied about all these evolutionary forces, we have typically thought about it as one population at one place and experiencing one environment and so on. But in nature, in real life, we know that that is seldom the case. In nature, we know that populations are typically spread over space, and at different spaces they are actually experiencing in many cases slightly different environments, and they are also drifting slightly differently, and the different kinds of mutations can be favored in one place versus the other. So, taken together, even if at a given patch, at a given spatial location, one genetic composition is getting favored, at a different genetic location another at a different spatial location another genetic composition can be favored. And therefore, if you look at each population by itself, that population may or may not have access to the best genes, but once you have migration happening, then all these genetic things getting shuffled around and all the influx that is happening, all that ends up becoming a very big source of high quality genetic variation on which then selection can act in your focal patch. So, in that sense, migration is actually, in the real world, it is a very potent force, and it is a force that can actually act against the variation reducing effects of selection, drift and assortative mating as we talked about. So, with this quick background, I am now going to give you a few examples of how migration has ended up affecting populations. So, the first example that I will take is of this species. These are grey wolves, and more specifically these are the Scandinavian grey wolves, the Scandinavian populations. So, the grey wolves have been distributed over large parts of Europe for a long time, but they were also hunted rather ruthlessly. And in the Scandinavia, that is the Norway, Finland, Sweden, that part of Europe, northern Europe basically, they were supposed to have gone extinct somewhere around the 1960s. However, in 1983, they discovered a breeding wolf pack about 900 kilometers from the nearest population. How it reached there, nobody knows, but the pack was there, and genetics studies suggested that this pack essentially started with just 2 individuals, that is it. Okay. So, basically one male, one female, and that is it. Now, this particular pack, the size in this remained low, and it just remained as one pack, and at best it was, the highest it reached was about 10 individuals in one breeding pack, that is it. Now, because the population size was so low, this pack actually suffered heavy amount of inbreeding and drift. We know this from genetic evidence that their allelic frequency, allelic variation was going down drastically. Although I am not aware of direct studies on what were the physiological effects that these populations were facing, it is known that other populations which have similar level of inbreedings, they were facing many physiological problems, including problems with the eyes, blindness. Okay. Now, you can imagine if you are a wolf, and that too living in the wild, then having low eyesight is a very, very bad thing that can happen to you. So, obviously this particular population was not doing very well, and then suddenly something happened. Around 1991, their population started increasing, and actually increasing pretty fast. So, turns out that around 1991, there was exactly one male wolf which migrated to this population from the eastern populations of the grey wolves found in Finland and Russia. And this particular male wolf, as luck would have it, this had a disproportionate success in mating. Now, why it had that, we do not know. Maybe it was very vigorous, or maybe those females over there really liked it. We do not know what exactly happened, but what we know is that of the 72 wolves which were born after 1993, 68 can trace at least part of their ancestry to this one immigrant male of 1991. Okay. And once this happened, the arrival of this wolf actually had a massive effect in terms of increasing the genetic diversity, allelic diversity of the Scandinavian wolf population. And this thing actually coincided very nicely with a very rapid increase in the population size. Today in 2023-24, that is the last census data that I could figure, the population size has actually gone up to 400 plus, and there are multiple breeding packs in that area, and by and large the population is actually doing very, very well. So, this is one example of how inbreeding depression coming due to drift or also founder effect, all that gets taken care of because you have a migrant. Now, why exactly is this happening? If you remember, we discussed when we were talking about inbreeding, we said that inbreeding, drift, all these things, they increase the homozygosity of the population. And when the homozygosity of the population goes up, then what happens? The rare alleles, rare recessive alleles which have bad effects, they start coming into the homozygous form. And when those alleles come into the homozygous form, then all these diseases start getting expressed, which is why typically inbreeding and inbreeding like effects due to drift, assortative mating, etc., all that leads to a reduction in the overall fitness. Now, obviously when you have new genes coming up, these genes and there is breeding with these new genes, then many of these recessive alleles, they again go back in a heterozygous form, and the moment they go back into the heterozygous form, the overall fitness goes up. So, this is what is in technical language also known as heterosis. When heterozygotes have much greater fitness than the corresponding homozygotes, it is called heterosis. So, it is thought that migration leads to this heterosis, which in turn ends up acting as an antidote against inbreeding or inbreeding like effects. Just to give you one more example. So, this is the Arctic fox, Vulpes lagopus. As you can see, it is a very cute looking animal. Its fur is, fur is also very, very expensive, and because of this fur, it has been hunted absolutely indiscriminately in Europe. So, although the population size used to be pretty high in tens of thousands, by the end of 19th century, only a few hundred individuals were left, and those also were not in one population, they were fragmented across multiple populations. So, obviously enormous amount of inbreeding was happening, enormous amount of drift was happening, and in the midst of all this, a particular Swedish population got started with just 7 individuals, and after getting started, remember it was all fragmented. So, this population ended up remaining isolated for 9 full years. So, heavy levels of inbreeding, and when all that happened, due to the inbreeding depression, there was very low levels of both reproduction and juvenile survival, and basically this population was in trouble. However, something happened. What happened? So, remember that this particular Arctic fox, this is very commercially important, right? So, people were thinking about captive breeding programs, which basically means that they were breeding foxes in artificial enclosures, and they were introducing these into the wild. So, between 2010 to 2011, there was a Norwegian captive breeding program from which they ended up releasing 3 male foxes, and these male foxes, they wandered around a bit in that area, and finally they immigrated into the Swedish population and they started reproduction over there. Turns out that in the first generation offspring itself that came out, there was 1.9 times higher juvenile survival and 1.3 times higher breeding success in the kids of the immigrants. So, obviously this was absolutely great, and 5 years after immigration, remember these are mammals, right. So, 5 years is not a very large time. 5 years after immigration, the population had more than doubled in size, allelic richness had increased by 41%, and if you look at 2010, only 10% of the litters were offspring of the immigrants. In 2015, within 5 years, 89% of the litters were related to the 3 immigrants, which basically means that their offspring were having a very high fitness under those circumstances. They were probably surviving more and they were also reproducing more, as the figures suggest. So, this is again one example of where just 3 individuals, they are able to rescue a population in a very, very big way. Now, if this be the case, then does this imply that one should always introduce individuals from outside to genetically rescue populations with low genetic diversity? And although I would have loved to say that the answer is yes, unfortunately that is not the case. And the reason that is not the case is because just as you have inbreeding depression, you can also end up having something known as outbreeding depression. Now, what is outbreeding depression? So, outbreeding depression is the phenomena of reduced fitness in offspring arising from mating between individuals from very different populations. So, remember what we have been saying till now is that if you have, let us say, 2 populations and drift might be happening in these 2 populations, or inbreeding depression might be happening, and you bring them together, heterosis will happen and the hybrids will have high fitness. Now, we are saying the hybrids will have low fitness, right. Now, how can this be? What can lead to this? So, there are many ways in which this can happen. So, I will give you just 2 examples. So, for example, suppose each population has actually adapted very well in their respective habitat, okay. And when they have adapted very well in their respective habitats, now if you are bringing those genes, okay, I mean adapted very well is in 2 different contexts. One is they have adapted very well in the context of their respective environments. Also, the alleles that are responsible for that adaptation, those are very well suited in those given genetic backgrounds. In other words, epistasis is happening, okay. Now, if you suddenly make them hybrids, then what is happening? Alleles of one genetic background are now getting expressed in another genetic background. And if that happens, if the epistatic effects are not proper, then that can end up leading to reduced fitness. So, this is one way which it can happen. The other way is something that we have already talked about, which is underdominance. What is underdominance? Remember, underdominance is a situation where the heterozygotes have less fitness than the two homozygotes. So, if the genetics of these alleles are such that there is underdominance, then obviously the moment you end up breeding them together, the hybrids are going to have lower fitness. Now, do we have examples of such a scenario, outbreeding depression? And turns out that we have quite a few examples in the literature. So, I will just show you one or two. So, the first example is from this lovely fish known as rainbow trout. So, these are fishes which are eaten, and therefore, they are of some commercial importance. So, this is an example from Canada where they have wild populations, and Van der Steen et al. They also took individuals from a fishery. So, it is well known that when fishes are raised in a fishery generation after generation, then they adapt to the fishery conditions, which is what is basically they get domesticated to the fishery conditions. So, what Van der Steen et al. Did was they took the wild fishes, they took the domesticated fishes, and then basically created hybrids. And then they took these populations, and then they released all three types, the wild, the domesticated and the hybrids, to two different natural lakes and studied their survivorship. And what they found was that the hybrid had a survivorship which was intermediate between the two parents in one lake, but not in the other. And the main lesson from this is that outbreeding depression can be context specific. Now, here I have to tell you one more thing. Outbreeding depression can not only be context specific, outbreeding depression can also be definition specific. So, I will just tell you what I mean. So, I defined outbreeding depression as when you have hybrids from two different populations having lower fitness. Now, when I am talking about it, I am thinking in terms of populations which are coming, two populations of the same species, right. Now, that is the context in which the term outbreeding depression is typically used, but sometimes they also use the term outbreeding depression to mean when you have hybrids of two different species or hybrids of two different subspecies of the same species. Okay. Now, technically speaking, the entire biological species definition says that look, if you are calling two things as two different species, then that automatically means that their hybrids are either not going to form, or if they form, they are going to have low fitness, right. So, that kind of outbreeding depression where you are talking about hybrids between two species, you actually expect that, right. What is less expected is you have the same species, two different populations, but the hybrids between them having lower amount of fitness, and that is the kind of outbreeding depression that we are dealing with over here. So, this is the first example from rainbow trouts. The second example is from the world of plants. So, this is Arabidopsis thaliana, also known as tail craze. Most of you have probably heard this name. It is a very well known model system extensively used by molecular biologists and botanists. So, what Oakley et al. Did was they took two independent population pairs each from Italy and Sweden. Okay. So, basically they had two different locations in Italy, two different locations in Sweden. From each location they ended up taking two different populations. Okay. So, 2 plus 2 4 populations from Italy, 2 plus 2 4 populations from Sweden, paired them up, and then essentially compared the fitnesses of the hybrids against both parents. And in this particular case, they measured fitness as how many fruits were set, how many seeds were set, and in one pair, okay, between the Italy and Sweden pair, the hybrids had greater fitness than either parents, what I call as heterosis. In the other pair, the hybrids had 15 to 44% reduction in fitness. Okay, fitness, as I said, fruit and seed production. So, what this is telling you is that even if you have the same species, sometimes you will have heterosis and sometimes you will have outbreeding depression, which again boils down to the same thing. Outbreeding depression is very context specific. It all depends on which species, which environment, under what condition, and so on and so forth. So, what do we do, okay, to outbreed or not to outbreed? That is the question. So, turns out that there is some bit of controversy in the literature about this. So, on one hand you have people, for example, this is a review in 2007 which straight away says that the risk of outbreeding, particularly in the second generation, are on par with the risks of inbreeding, which basically means they are equally bad. So, you better not outbreed until and unless you are very, very sure. However, at the same time there is another review in 2015, and here what I am giving you is the title of the review itself, which simply says that genetic rescue of small inbred populations, meta-analysis reveals large and consistent benefits of gene flow, which basically means please outbreed. So, the overall picture is that there is some bit of controversy. Lots of people, particularly Frankham et al., believe that by and large inbreeding depression and getting rid of it using migration is a very good idea, and they have actually suggested that what are the conditions under which one expects outbreeding and how to take care of it. So, that is not a part of this course. I want you to look it up in case you are interested. But the main point that I want to make over here is that there is a debate, and the debate is still continuing. We still do not know precisely what the answer is. So, what exactly have we learned till now? So, we started with the history of evolutionary thought in the first week, and then we looked at various evidences which leads us to believe that evolution has indeed happened, and then we talked about the various mechanics, various mechanisms or forces that lead to evolution. We talked about, we started with the raw material, which was variation, then we talked about mutation, we talked about selection, we talked about drift, assortative mating, inbreeding, and now we have spoken about migration. So, roughly speaking, these are the major forces that are responsible for microevolution. And now, with this background, we need to ask the question, what exactly is evolution explaining? What are the various patterns that one can think about which can be explained based on these forces? And that is what is going to be the focus of the next 3 or 4 weeks of discussion. See you then. Bye.